Hmm? Ah!
You're getting me with no hat and my beard's growing back. I shave it off once a year. So I'm like, I hate how I get this chinage thing going on. So whenever I don't have to make any like public appearances till like another 2 weeks. So I figured, okay, I got to shave it off once a year. And then now it's like, oh, great. I'm on Blab all the time. It's like,
Well, what you did is just recorded the intro to this episode. Podcast Junkies, episode 61. In case you missed the show last week, I got to speak to my buddy, Motion Melvin, aka Mo, host of The Mo Show. And I think if you did listen to it, I'm sure you had an opinion about his show one way or the other. And I always tell people you should definitely have an opinion. Otherwise, you're being too vanilla in your podcasts. And so I just really like that he educated me on some of the history of comedy on the radio. And it was really a fascinating conversation. If you have not checked that out, then go ahead and do so. Episode number 60. If you're new to the show, this is what I like to call the podcaster's voice. This is the place where we get to speak to fantastic and engaging and fun and entertaining and all around cool podcasters, hosts of some of your favorite and my favorite shows out there, and people that I've come across through my various trips to conferences, forays into new technologies such as Blab and Periscope and Google Hangouts, and just trying to make myself known far and wide and meet people far and wide as I can, because I think I constantly have to get out of my own comfort zone in order to find out what other people are doing in the space and who are other interesting people that I should be talking to. And one of those people is Jason Bryant. He is founder of the website Matt Talk Online, which is a collection of podcasts all around wrestling. Most of them are wrestling, and actually a majority of them are ones that he hosts himself. His show is the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. And so Jason has been doing this for the better part of his life. I mean, wrestling is in his blood. Broadcasting and being on the radio is in his blood. And you'll understand very quickly as you hear him talk through his history and his passions, how it's just so clear that he was made to do this. This is something that he was being groomed for, I think, before he even knew he was being groomed for it. And he's got such an energy level, and the time went by so quickly because he's just very engaging person, very easy to talk to. And he and I both love talking about podcasting, about what we're doing to make our shows grow, and how each one of us brings our own passions, him with his love and interest in broadcasting and wrestling into the show, and all the different ways that he's looked at building his show, and of course how he's been able to now monetize it and position himself as an expert and as a speaker, and as someone who can produce other shows, high quality shows for that matter. So it's really fascinating what he's doing. And I see this as a follow-up to the conversation he had with Dave Jackson on the School of Podcasting. So I definitely encourage you to check that episode out and then use this as a companion show. And I think after listening to both of them, you'll get a nice all-around, well-painted picture of who my buddy Jason is. So enjoy our conversation. Thank you, Jason Bryant, for being on Podcast Junkies.
It's my pleasure. I've been listening for a while. I'm stoked to be here.
Why are you stoked to be on Podcast Junkies?
Because I love Podcast Junkies, and I am your target avatar. I am a podcast junkie.
I'm curious, when did you find the show?
Actually, I was thinking about that before we started. I was like, man, when did I? Because I remember seeing you sit down at NMX, and I actually saw it on the board that you had signed up in Podcast Alley for a show. And I'm like, hey, I listened to that show. And, because I remember I briefly spoke to you about the music that was in the intro, which was very atypical, I thought, for, podcast shows. And I'm sitting there and I went back. I was like, well, what was my, before we started, I was like, what was the first show? And it was probably the Daniel J. Lewis show. So it was definitely back in 2014 because when I was jumping in, I was consuming everything I could from like Daniel Ray and Dave Jackson. So I was like finding it was like, oh, here's Daniel on another show. And some of the stuff was kind of the same. But then there's always the one thing that Podcast Junkies brings is you're asking stuff that's not always in the podcast about podcasting space. Harry Duran, I like your tempo and I like your cadence. So so it's probably been since I believe that date was June of 2014. I've been listening.
So prior to that, obviously, I imagine you had a ton of podcasts on your smartphone of choice, and things that you were listening to on a regular basis. And what were some of those shows?
Some of them are the usual suspects. The first one I actually discovered when I really decided to say I started listening to podcasts more so now that I started doing them. It was initially I did a show back in like 2008, but I really didn't listen to any podcasts back then. But I was on a drive. About an 8-hour drive to Topeka, Kansas for the NAI National Wrestling Championships. And I started listening, and I was listening to a lot of Daniel stuff because what I had found, I'd started editing with Audacity, and that's how I kind of stumbled upon his show is, I guess it was early 2014. And I started listening, and I was basically binge listening to some of his episodes. And then I from that, I discovered he pitched the Podcasters Roundtable. So there I am driving through like southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, illegally probably searching stuff on my phone. And, I was like, oh, what's this Podcasters Roundtable? And then I listened to that episode. And I think I was in a drive-through in like somewhere in Missouri when it's like, oh, okay, let me find this. Okay. I heard Dave Jackson and Ray Ortega on that. I was like, okay, let me download those guys. And then I started listening to those three pretty consistently because I was a little bit into the tech. I had some equipment, and that's definitely Ray's wheelhouse there. So I started listening to those shows. And of course, those shows lead to their guests, which lead to those shows, which lead to those shows. So it's kind of snowballed. So I think I've listened to pretty much every podcast about podcasting in the last 2 years. But obviously there's some that are definitely worth listening to more than others, and some that listen to like 30 seconds. Nope. Swipe. What is it? I don't know. I don't do the Tinder thing since I'm married. So what is it? Swipe left, swipe right, whatever deleted it, I unsubscribe. But those are pretty much where I started. And then now it's evolved to like Overcast. I'll look at my phone here. Let's see. At last count, I was like subscribed to like, I think it's close to 100 podcasts, and they're varied. A lot of podcasts about podcasting, a lot of basically everybody that I've kind of met through New Media Expo and then Podcast Midwest. I didn't get a chance to go to Podcast Movement. That will change in 2016. That will change.
Hope so.
So I've listened to things, obviously there's the serials and then the season and things like that. But for the most part, it started out with podcasts about podcasting that kind of opened up my eyes to more podcasts other than what I was kind of just focused into.
So it's interesting. You mentioned Tinder. I think it's somewhat what Clamor is trying to do because you get the audio snippets and you get to listen really quickly, but those are sort of force-fed to you. But it would be interesting if there was an app where you could just listen and see the artwork and sort of get it's almost like you get a chance to do your elevator pitch, right? And
Swell was kind of doing that. I actually got my show on Swell before they got bought out, and it was like their Discovery was trying to like, some weird, I don't know, what does Pandora call it, like the Music Genome Project? Yeah. I don't know if there was some weird algorithm on how they were finding it all. I was listening to my show and it's like, what does it suggest after that? So Swell kind of had that for a little bit, but sadly that went away. I kind of like their platform.
It's interesting because I grew up, you may have heard, as a DJ, and one of the skills you get is when this is dating myself, but I used to go back into record stores and there was a ton of vinyl, right? And I figured, okay, which are the tracks I'm going to buy that I'm going to play out? And so I would grab 30, 40 vinyl and head on over to the turntable, and I'd put the needle on like 3 or 4 spots on the record. I'm like, okay, no, I don't like it. And I just over time would have this discerning ear, and it sounds like you've developed something similar when it came to figuring out, with your time being so precious, what is it about this podcast that catches your ear in those first 30 seconds?
Yeah, sometimes it's, obviously when we just skip through if it's an ad in the first 30 seconds, you're obviously going to skip it and give them at least maybe the first 2 minutes or something. But I don't know. A lot of it, I think, like with Dave Jackson, for example, I just find him to be supremely personal. personable rather, and he's just it sounds like he's a guy you could sit down at a bar and talk to, and this is true because I've sat down at a bar and talked to him. So he's the same guy off the microphone that he is at an event or in his real life. So that's the one thing that I find a connection. Jen Briney is kind of the same way. Met her at New Media Expo, and I have no interest in politics. Zero, none. Hate it. Don't talk about politics. Don't care. Basically, it's like, that episode of South Park. Yep, don't care. But Jen, I've learned stuff about Congress and stuff from her show, and meeting her, and like I joke with Corey Finneran and Nick Serberling as far as their shows, because they're the podcast group therapy group that we do fairly frequently. The Cubs have to lose, I think, for Corey to jump back in and starting those shows back up again. And of course, the Bengals are like undefeated right now, so they're in hog heaven. But meeting those, I'm not a Cubs fan, I'm not a Bengals fan, but I listen to their shows at least to a point. I don't massively consume them because I'm not a Bengals or a Cubs fan. But I've found that when you get into this community and you meet people, you start enjoying their content because you know what they're going through. That they're putting out a show. They've got the same hurdles you do. So it's a little bit of it's a self-help group. It's almost like their group name, Podcasters Group Therapy. That's essentially what it is. So, and through that, I've met some other people. I think one woman, Emily, her last name escapes me right now, does Classy Little Podcast. That show is hilarious. I mean, I don't have any interest really in wine and cheese other than when my wife wants to go out and we'll get a bottle of wine or something. I'm not a wine snob, but it's just there's certain things I've discovered by meeting people that make a show enjoyable. But as far as that discerning ear, I'm getting back to your initial questions. Sometimes it's the intro song. I was like, oh yeah, I like that. Dave Jackson he's got a music background. I like hearing the hard rock, and that's kind of what I listen to. And then, just hearing knowledge. If I can hear somebody, and it's just if their voice isn't necessarily always the greatest, maybe for, there's a radio voice and then there's a podcast voice, there's a TV voice. And then sometimes when I'm on television, I'll make a voice like that. It's not fake. You hear their real voices. Like Daniel's experience just comes out. I mean, he's got that real direct tone, and he really makes it conversational. So when I hear things like that, it just makes me want to listen. So obviously, and then the 1.5 and the 2x speeds kind of change that a little bit. But there's still some shows I will not speed up because I want to hear how they do it.
Yeah, you almost have to give props to the effort, and I do this with the storytelling ones. I listen to them at 1x speed, but like I've mentioned before, if it's comedy or if it's just something that I can listen to while I'm doing the dishes or I'm walking the dog, I don't have to it's not rocket science, and I don't mind blasting through it because otherwise there's no way I'm going to get through the ton of shows I have on and that I want to listen to. And like you said, I'm attracted to the personalities, and now I listen because I feel like I've met these people in real life and they're my friends, and I want to see what's going on with their show, and you just become more and more discerning because you're going to have to swipe off some of the stuff that's at the bottom of the list that you realize at some point you'll never get to.
Well, it's sometimes too, it's like if there's people that people that I know that they have a guest that it's like, I'm really not interested in. The podcast about podcasting show is not quite like that, but if there's I subscribe to Entrepreneur on Fire, for example. I don't listen to every show. As a matter of fact, I've listened to maybe one of his last 100 because there was a guest that I was interested in. I think it was the real Bryant. But, it's like, so I keep an eye on that show. It's not something I routinely listen to. So I'm looking at shows like that for guests too. It's like, okay, I want to hear what this guy's got to say. Tim Ferriss is good like that.
Yeah. I
don't listen to Tim Ferriss religiously. He's got a guest. I'm trying to get him on my show, which is another name drop. I'm writing there. Tim, if you're listening, hey, Short Time Wrestling Podcast. I'm trying to get you on because he was a wrestler. So, there's those contacts right there that I want to listen to the certain guests that, the Glenn the Geek guy has become, he was on Dave Jackson's show, and it was like, man, I want to hear more from this guy. And, anytime Daniel's a guest, I want to hear what he's got to say because he'll always bring something different to the table. Same with Dave Jackson.
Yeah, I think for us in the space that have podcasts and growing other shows, we want to understand where can we listen to find out what's going on in the industry. And a lot of times we cover it we hear it covered at certain times because it's hot, like something like Blab. But people like Daniel and people like Dave keep us on our toes with what the latest and the greatest is, and they're always testing things too. So they're helping us learn because we're sort of going along with what they're doing and their process and maybe some of the mistakes they make. So anything we can do, I think, to make our shows better and tweak along the way and and that's why I listen to the new media show as well to find out what's going on in the industry. So I think all those podcasts that you mentioned round it out for us and keep us on top and help us stay on top of our game. Otherwise, if we had to do it ourselves, I would personally wouldn't have enough time in the day.
Well, those shows, there's a lot of bad information. I mean, I'm actually talking with a buddy of mine who just started a show called Wrestling with Greatness, where he interviews entrepreneurs that have wrestling backgrounds of what they did about their success. So that's like super niche and a super niche, kind of like me. And I've actually known this guy for a while, and we were just actually trading emails. Is like, what type of stuff do I do here? Is like, well, there's bad information. There's these guys sift it out. I was actually at a Twin Cities podcasters meetup on Saturday, the first one I'd attended. I think they've done 4. And at the table, I was the only one with an active podcast. There were 6 of us. It was a small group. And one person there had already had a couple and looking to start another. And one guy asked me, he's like, well, what are your top 5 tips? And I'm sitting there going, these are the things I've learned from Daniel, Ray, and Daniel, Ray, and Dave, the tripods, as I like to call them. So I learned from them. It's like, listen to them, but here's what I learned from them. It's like, first one was like no feed burner. That was like the first thing I told him, because I remember looking at that years ago going, what the heck do I do with this? So, but yeah, those are those things. And these guys really, they just cut through all the BS and really, there's a lot of resources, and you'll find that the better shows about this industry that is podcasting, they're all going to probably share the same idea. They may not all implement them. It's like, your scheduling options is Calendly. And I looked at it and I started tweaking with it. I'm like, it doesn't work for me, but it doesn't mean it doesn't work for everybody else. So, but when there's things that don't work, stay away.
Yeah, just accept the fact that that's why there's so many different flavors, like for scheduling tools, for podcast hosts, for podcast microphones, because what works for one person's voice and one person's method of working and process flow is that if you try to say, take exactly what I do and replicate it, it's not going to work, because we're just all different people and we like different things, and all those things can succeed. All those things can work, and all those things can succeed for your podcast, and just find what fits for you, trial and error.
Oh, trial and error is basically my mantra. I mean, it's like writing I had a WordPress page and I was still writing my own XML code. Why? I mean, it wasn't even with my first podcast. It was with my second one when I was at USA Wrestling. And it was like, I had a WordPress page and I was like, well, wait a minute. I was hand coding the embed. I was trying to find the Google player and trying to, it was so bad. If I'd have discovered those guys before I started that show in 2010, I would have been like so much further ahead of the game when I tried to officially kind of make this my thing in 2013. So yeah, they save a lot of headaches.
What was the very first podcast that you put online?
It was called Wrestling 411, and it was I didn't know it was a podcast at the time either. I've kind of told the story a couple times, but the story is I was working for the National Wrestling Coaches Association, running their media website in Manheim, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Lancaster in Amish country. And I had an opportunity to move out to Minnesota. The coach here at the University of Minnesota is a guy named Jay Robinson, always kind of thinking outside the box. Well, this is in 2008, and they wanted to start a television show about college wrestling, kind of make it a sports center of college wrestling. But it wasn't just TV. They wanted to do online. They wanted to do radio. They wanted to do television. They wanted to stream the radio thing live. So a friend of mine that I'd worked with, they brought both of us up to Minnesota, and basically they said, okay, figure it out. And I'm like, okay, well, we need to be on a radio station. What do we find? So we called up some of the lower, we weren't going to get on we're not going to have the money to pay for the airtime for some of these major ones. So we sought out some of they looked at the AM stations and was like, they're not getting anything there. So then I was like, well, I worked in college radio for 6 years. Let's see what the colleges have. And a couple of them, obviously their email addresses were, the college radio websites, even to this day, aren't really super organized. But Augsburg College, they were receptive. They're like, yeah, we got time, because they were kind of a student-run thing. It wasn't really regimented by the faculty. So we paid them, and a small monthly fee. It was like really nothing when you look at it was worth probably 15-second ad buy for an entire, for one episode is how much it ended up costing us. And we're in there, and they've got the phone line so we can get callers. And then I was like, well, how do you stream it? And I looked, and there's this program. It was called Nicecast. I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then we realized after a couple months that the technology, but I'm getting off track. So the first show, we're at KOG at Augsburg College, which is about 12 minutes. It's a suburban. It's an urban school. It's like right across the river from the University of Minnesota. It's got a great wrestling tradition, so it made sense that we were at Augsburg. Real small school. It's a really cool little school, and we did the studio show there. We did it live, and Nicecast like blew up on itself. I mean, I think at the time you could kind of move the sliding scale to lower the quality, to increase the number of listeners. I think it was maxed out at 50. And I remember seeing that icon, and it told you how many people were listening live, and it was like 50, 49, 50, 50. And it's like people are like sending me text messages and emails like, I can't listen there, and then we had a call from Tom Brands, the Iowa head coach, and it was like the soundboard. He's Jason Bryant, I can't hear you. So I basically have to talk, hit the board, cut off my mics, wait for his response, hit the board to talk again, it was, and then we had cameras in here. We had two cameras, one recording Kyle, one recording me. And then we would put that archive video online. So the first one was a show. It was November. I'm actually putting the old archives back up on the web. I want to say November 11th, 2008 was the first one we put online. And we didn't know it was a podcast until like weeks later, because I'm looking at the site and I didn't know anything really about WordPress at the time. And I see that iTunes logo. I'm like, wait a minute, iTunes, this is a podcast. So that was the first one. And the audio quality was atrocious. It was so bad. And we were using a radio studio. I mean, and we had the phone line punched in. We had a CD player playing our music. I mean, it was like, yeah, well, that was the first one.
What was it about the audio that made it sound so bad?
It was an old phone line system from a college radio station. When would you think the last time that thing was serviced? 1976? It was cool because it did have the phone flasher. Yeah. So, the light in the radio station that flashes. I mean, those of you in radio knows exactly what that is. And yeah, that was tough.
So I mentioned that I heard your interview with Dave Jackson on the School of Podcasting, and I'll invite folks to check that out, because I think what you provided there was a complete breakdown of all the how the podcast got started, and covered some of the technology and the challenges and the inspiration and who you're from there. So don't want to rehash that too much, and I want to invite folks to check that out as well, because I think they can complement each other. And so,
the School of Podcasting, Dave Jackson. Wow, I love that intro.
You know what's so funny about that is
my wife thinks it's terrible. She's like, that is so bad. I'm like, what are you talking about? That's great.
When you listen to enough shows, and you listen to enough episodes of shows, all that stuff, like I could sing the intros to a couple of my favorite podcasts, like Profitcast, right? He's like, let's rock it. And it's like, everyone's got these taglines.
I'm so tired of being lied to, like, a Jen show.
Yeah, it's, and Jen Briney's awesome. Shout out to Jen Briney. But we connect with the personalities. And I think that's, at the end of the day, like, no matter what the content is, like what you alluded to, we connected the personalities. So you jumped into your first podcast, but where did you get the inspiration to actually forget about podcasting, just get behind the mic or talk about this topic, and realize that this is something that you maybe wanted to grow into a career? Because there's tons of folks that take up wrestling, right? And then when they're done with wrestling, it's something that they did in high school, they did in college, and then they forget about it and it's never a part of their life. But that's obviously not the case with you.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about that, because we have a real problem in our sport with retention. And I actually had one guy discover, like, yeah, I used to wrestle back in the day, and I was just searching wrestling on iTunes randomly, and I found your show, and I'm like, okay, iTunes search does work. But yeah, I mean, we have a problem with like engaging the people that are in the sport that get out, that aren't going to be high school wrestling coaches, that aren't going to be youth coaches. I mean, usually the way you're into it, you're connected to it somehow. I'm unique in the fact that I'm the only one in my family that ever wrestled. I didn't start wrestling until I was a junior in high school. I never even saw a wrestling match until I was a sophomore in high school. So the desire to get behind a microphone has always been there. In fifth grade, I would miss the bus watching SportsCenter. I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. Always have. That was been my career goal. So, I would sit there and I would go to like the semi-pro football games that were played at like, the high school field these are basically weekend warrior type guys. And I would go and I would handwrite stories about the game. And, that's in like, middle school, I'm doing that. And then when I got into high school, my high school baseball coach, a guy named George Yeager, he knew I was into broadcasting. He knew I wanted to do this. And he had a friend he went to high school with named Greg Martin, who was a local DJ. He actually sat in and did, would do fill-in segments for people. Like somebody had to miss, he would go in and sit in, and he'd worked in radio for 20 something years. So he really taught me how to work a microphone my freshman year in high school with PA announcing at high school baseball games. And that was just kind of my wheelhouse. I mean, I've been comfortable on a microphone ever since. I mean, public speaking's a little bit of a different story, but like, you put me in a microphone in front of 10,000 people, I got no problem. Granted, I get the butterflies. I get nervous every time, but that's really where getting behind the microphone was harnessed. And, obviously with the interest in journalism and broadcasting, I worked at the school paper. I was on the yearbook staff. I worked at a daily newspaper. I mean, as a senior in high school, I was working at a really large daily newspaper, not more than just, I wasn't delivering papers. I was taking the calls. I was writing little, paragraph blurbs and stuff. And then eventually I started getting bylines in the paper, and, I was writing pretty regularly, and then staying with the college situation. So I'd always wanted to be in sports broadcasting, and the wrestling thing kind of got in the way when I really fell in love with the sport in high school, and then took that to college, and I created a website. My first website was Matt Talk Online, and I've rebranded it and brought it back. I launched that October 25th, 1997. I actually always have the launch date out of my dorm, Whitehurst Hall at Old Dominion University. And I remember that day, and I remember walking around to my suite mates going, "Dude, I got 10 hits today," like thinking it was the greatest thing. So being able to be behind a microphone, that's something I've always wanted to do. I've done television, I've done radio, but that's something it's what I want to do. And then wrestling, I've worked in several different manners of it, with broadcasting and writing and online stuff, social media, marketing. And it's just a sport that, there's this theory, people ever says, you're a big fish in a small pond. You know what? I'm fine with that. I'm absolutely fine with that, because I think I can make an impact to a higher concentration of people doing what I do, that share the same passion as I do, that want to know the information. And that's kind of what really sparked, is like, hey, Wrestling 411 was a gut check, because I was a cocky, egotistical 29-year-old when I took over that. And I'm like, yeah, people love me. I'm this. I've won awards. I'm the best. And when that project tanked, it was like, well, maybe nobody gives a crap about what I actually say. So eventually, I think they do. But it was just it was a hard lesson in humility back then when that project failed. And I thought it was because, we weren't raising a whole lot of money, because that was another issue entirely. But yeah, I mean, I love the people in the sport of wrestling. It's very, very, very similar to podcasters, because I told this to Nick and Corey when I was at NMX. We're talking probably second, third day. I was like, man, I felt like I've known you guys my entire life. And I felt like I had that same instant rapport with the people I met there, that, with the wrestling community. There are people that I see once a year at tournaments, and we pick right up where we left off. So there's a lot of things between the podcasting community and the wrestling community. Super niche, super engaged, super almost zealots, if you will, about what we do. So, being able to speak to that audience, I don't need that. That's the inspiration I need, because I know people do listen. People actually do respect what I say. But the passion, again, for being behind a microphone, that started when I was like 9-10 years old, calling in the local sports radio station. Jason from Pocosin. I'm like 10 years old calling in to Tony Mercurio.
What's fascinating as you tell that story, there's a couple of things I want to touch upon. Your recollection of dates and names is uncanny.
I don't know how it's weird, because I've always said, like, I can remember stats from a high school baseball game I was at my freshman year. I remember I'll throw this out right now. Chris Riley, my senior year, threw a no-hitter against Grafton on the second game of the year, but he plunked the first batter, walked the next two, plunked the fourth one, walked in a run, and then no-hit the guys the rest of the game. So it's like something like that. I mean, I remember stuff like that. It's not a gift. It's sometimes a curse.
Was that something that helped you, or did you have that when you were in school? Like
Dude, I was a super nerd, man. I mean, what's funny is there was a guy who was on Jeopardy a couple years ago who I went to high school with. And we would sit our freshman year in high school. We like sit in a cafeteria and have one of those big, thick sports almanacs that you'd go through and we would like quiz each other on the Division I college mascots. And it's like, Coastal Carolina, Chanticleers, Valparaiso, Crusaders, it's like, Western Illinois, Leathernecks, things like that. We would do that. And I would always remember stupid facts. I knew all the state capitals in the second grade. I just had a weird memory about some things. It's not like a super great one now. I think some of the things I did in college might have altered that a little bit, but there's still situations where I'll even joke if I'm out at a bar with some friends and be like, "Hey, ask me any D1 college mascot. If I don't get it, I'm too drunk to drive." I mean, I'm clearly joking, but that's kind of just like one of those things. It's like, yeah, that retention's kind of scary.
Was it something that the teachers noticed about you? I mean, obviously, everything. It sounds like it's all sports related. That just
when they weren't kicking me out of class because I talked nonstop. I mean, you're obviously seeing that right now. I was kicked out so many times for not shutting up. I wasn't like a disruption by being like a bad kid. I mean, I was the kid with straight A's that was getting kicked out of class. Granted, for the record, I only made straight A's once. So so I can actually say that. But yeah, I was like the guy that was always talking and like, Bryant, shut up. So they were frustrated by it. But the periodic table, I only got about half of that because that didn't.
But I imagine that if you at some point decided that the periodic table was something that was going to be a passion for you and you attacked it with the same fervor that you've done with wrestling and broadcasting, you'd probably be on Star Talk Radio, Neil deGrasse Tyson type level of expertise.
Another guy I want on my show, another former wrestler.
Really?
Yeah, if that was the case, cadmium would be I'd beast down on cadmium and Einsteinium, some of those like not naturally occurring elements.
You talked about the wrestling, the demise of Wrestling 411 and the lesson that taught you. Why do you think it was important and to have some humility and going through that to make you what you are today?
Everybody needs a gut check. Everybody needs a reality check. And sometimes that takes, some people that tell these stories that are, much worse off situations, some people got to hit rock bottom before they can climb back up. Well, I'm not, what I hit was not rock bottom, but it was hard to realize that I was like, okay, nobody's going to help me here. And, they've done everything they can and we've done everything we can, and it just didn't work. And, that's where you just, okay, if I'd have known, what's funny is what I'm doing now is almost exactly what I was doing back then. And we were, the similar format, the WordPress installation, it was PodPress versus PowerPress versus Libsyn, whatever. Now, just you need some, obviously, people talk about, in wrestling, you learn more from a loss than you do a win. Well, in life, you can learn more from a failure than you can a success. And, I know what not to do now. So I know listener trends. I know what not to do in turn. It teaches you things about, here's how you approach this all wrong. And you got to see that from a 20,000 foot view. When you're in the situation, you're going to still think that, no, this is going to work. This is going to work. Guess what? It didn't. What are you going to do now? Well, you can try again. And are you going to do the exact same thing, the same way, the same time, and have it happen again? No, you learn from it. So for me, it was, ultimately I landed on my feet out of that position. And believe it or not, the job I took at USA Wrestling thereafter, I learned a lot about what I was doing in that job from doing it hands-on first time through at Wrestling 411. So when I was approached by the national governing body for a position, and now I'm doing video editing because I had done it trial by fire with Final Cut Pro, and I'd done audio editing, and I was doing live streaming. So everything I learned at 411 actually helped me in my next job. It's just that wasn't the right place and the right time for what we were trying to do.
Who instilled these values in you? Because it's something I think that was inherent in you. And when this incident happened, you realized that was the course of action you had to take. But I imagine someone instilled this in you at an early age.
I don't know. That's kind of tough. I got to say, right around that time when 411 was starting to tank, that's when I met my my soon-to-be wife. And my wife, Abby, was super grounded. She had a master's. She was actually finishing up her master's at the University of Minnesota, had worked for a company since she got an internship as a sophomore. So, my wife is sharp. She's the smartest person I've ever met, which can kind of, when somebody's smarter than you, it's really tough to argue with them. So, it was basically, she had this realistic, grounded sense of of self and whatnot. But I grew up in a pretty. It was not an ideal home type of thing. So the way I kind of coped with issues with alcoholism at home is I was doing all this stuff at school. So my freshman year was just one sport. I started playing football as a sophomore, and then that was the time my younger sister, who's about 6.5 years younger than me, was into school, and I needed to spend less time on at football practice and football field, and I had to keep an eye on her a little bit more. So I found something that could fill the gaps, and I could still be involved in sports. I started doing the announcing and the stats for the girls basketball team, which in Virginia at that time, the high schools they played in the fall, the boys were in the winter. And then when we were in the wintertime, it was volleyball and then boys basketball. And then of course I discovered wrestling. And then in the spring, it was baseball, then soccer came on the board. So I kept myself away from what was a very, I don't want to, it's not a horror story type of home life, but it was not ideal. I was in I was a step kid. So there's some of those things that play into it. And there's a lot of mistakes that I'm trying not to make as a father that I witnessed myself. So I think some of that comes with not wanting to replicate or get sucked in to what I had come out of. So I don't know if I was taught by that or if it was just, I was always surrounding myself with people away from home that were good. Like two of my best friends that were the best men at my wedding they're probably 10, 12 years older than I was. And I was actually a junior counselor in one of their summer day camp programs where they were the counselor and I was like the 14-year-old there kind of volunteering. And they kind of, took me under their wing in terms of being, positive male role models. They were good people. We're still friends to this day. They're kicking my butt in my fantasy football league. But for the most part, I just surrounded myself with people that were encouraging and, ultimately believed. A lot of kids in high school are going to poke fun at the kid that does all the stuff with sports that doesn't play any of them. So, when I got on the wrestling team, that kind of quelled some of that, even though I was terrible. But, I think just I always thought that I was going to be on ESPN by the time I was 25. So I kind of tried to push that away. So I don't know where it came from. I just think it was kind of learned from, there's hundreds of people I could probably think that contributed to me kind of being able to pull myself out of what could have been a very damaging situation. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't make the greatest decisions in college either. I was an undergraduate for 7 years and I went on I had a full academic ride. I chose Old Dominion over Brown. Yeah, get that. I chose a local school over Brown because I couldn't afford it, and two, I hated the cold. So I had all those media contacts. I knew all the local newscasters. I worked at the newspaper. I didn't want to go somewhere and start over and have it be super more competitive and have no advantage. So I just, it's one of those things where I made mistakes. I've made a lot of mistakes, and some of them there's a time in my life I was pretty much an unsavory person at times, but ultimately what pulled me out was just having the right people to like, dude, come on. And I was not in a situation where I was ever close to prison or heavy drugs or anything like that, but I was just I've always had a good small group of friends that is like, no matter what, I call them up like, hey man, let's go hang out. I wasn't like for me, it was a bad place, but I know there's a lot of people that have been in a lot worse places. So, it's not like I'm laying in a gutter with or a meth den or anything like that. Nothing that extreme, but they're all learning experiences. And I think, just being, I guess two of my best friends, Kurt and Chris Van Dusen, are the guys that really help keep me from going into a rut that so many generations of people never get a chance to get out of.
Well, there's a common thread because then when I heard your interview with Dave and some of the things you've touched on here is really over the course of your life, the importance of mentors. I don't know if you would even call them father figures, and the fact that these friends of yours, these best men, were that much older than you. But I think they've provided this rock or this guiding light for you when otherwise you would have strayed off the path if you didn't have those folks in your life.
Yeah, there's people that, you mentioned something like that. And there's a guy I worked with at the newspaper. His name is Jim Hodges. He's a retired journalist. He covered the LA Kings for like 15 years. He worked for the LA Times. And then he came back to retire. Basically, he took a job, married his high school sweetheart. That's a cool story. And, he was sitting there. And when I first met him, I hated school. I was like, I didn't want to do this. I was, unhealthy, smoking 2 packs a day. I was at the bar every night, but I was still working at the newspaper. I cared about wrestling. I cared about my job, but I could give two craps about school. And then, he kind of started putting that bug in my ear. He'd tell me stories about guys that he worked with when they were my age, and they would sleep on his couch, and now they're so and so on ESPN, or they're so and so that works for the Chicago Tribune, or they're so and so. So Jim Hodges is a guy that I'll always credit to really kind of get me on my professional path. It's like get your ass in the class, man. So the mentors, yeah, there's that. So people like that definitely do play a role. So, I mean, I can look at Jim as far as a professional aspect. The late Warner Hessler was another guy. He was a beat writer for the Washington Redskins for decades at the Daily Press, and he taught me so much. Guys like Joe Reedy, who have been all over Ohio, covering the Bengals, the Browns, the Indians. I mean, there's people you meet that are great at their profession, but they're also great at also sharing their mistakes with you and helping and relate them to you. So, I honestly think Jim Hodges, I think from a professional standpoint, really turned my life around, even though I quit the paper in 2004 after I went full time, realizing this is not what I want to do. And you know what? He's told me a story about that too. He says, I thought was the best job I ever had.
That's interesting. And it very clearly is going to color the way that you approach your success going forward and how you're going to pay it forward. And I think you're going to be inspired with what everyone's done for you. I think it's just going to be natural. And I'm sure you're doing it already in some capacity, but the passing of the torch, right? You're starting to mentor or inspire. I mean, even just with the podcast, I'm sure there's people that have called you and have been inspired what you do, and people that you come in contact with, and as you raise your children as well. As like, there's all aspects of that where you can begin to apply the lessons that you've learned and the gifts that you've been given.
Yeah, and it was funny. And as I talked about the podcasters meetup, and it was I don't, as much as I talk, as much as I kind of like being the center of attention, when having fun, I always crack the bad jokes and was like, hey, I'm always the loud. That's just who I am. But sitting at this meetup and then having the conversation turn kind of towards me, and I'm like, I'm the most experienced guy here. Okay, all right. And I handed out my cards, like, anybody needs anything, just let me know. And, it's nice to see that little, because I didn't have the time to like start a meetup on my own. I was looking for one, but I don't want the responsibility. So thankfully they've picked the tab up there, but sitting there going, okay, and a lot of the stuff I've learned in podcasting is because I've just been listening to other people and, trial and error best practices. But I'm somebody who's always had a hard time at taking compliments. I would immediately deflect. Or it's like, hey, JB, great job. And I would always go, yeah, well, I messed this thing up. I didn't know how to do it. And I'm still working on that. It's like, hey, JB, great show with Stanley Henson, man. That was great. And I'm like, thank you. Just, that's all you need to say. You nod your head, thank you, shake the hand, say, I appreciate it. That has made me a lot less weird around people too. And so, but I don't know if I'm a mentor. I mean, I think so many people in podcasting is like, yeah, got a little consulting thing. People want to ask me how to do their show. Sure. And it's funny because I've had one client who's actually taken me up on, like, they're going to do their own show. They're going to do it, but I need your help. So let me know where to send a check. And I don't have a rate for that. It's whatever they want to give me. So it's like weird because they're my friends. So
yeah.
Mentor, I mean, I'll be 90% of the time. I mean, there's even competitors in the field. They've asked, like, hey, what do you do? So, well, here's how you get your stuff in iTunes. Here's how you've got a Libsyn account. Okay, here's what you do. And those are people that are I'm kind of competing with for ears in some ways. So I'll help anybody pretty much.
Yeah, it's a great mindset, and something I touched upon with on an interview with Jason Kabasi. He's got the Walking Dead podcast, but he reached out to his competitors, and they actually ended up doing a show together. And I keep harping on it, and I think can't say this enough. It's important to have this abundance mindset where there's plenty of all of this pie to go around for everyone. And I think, you were probably helped in the past by folks. And so you find it naturally for you to help other folks is something that you just would do without thinking twice. And it's really, it doesn't take a lot of effort on your part to do it.
Well, and there's also the concept of kill them with kindness, right? There's people that probably don't like you, and they ask you for a favor and you still do it. And it's like, and it kind of burns them up because they're waiting for you to say no. They're waiting for a confrontation, and you don't let it happen. So it's one of those things where, yeah, I can be a jerk, I can be arrogant, I can be a real pain in the ass, but it's like, at the end of the day, I'm probably going to help you. I mean, it's just one of those things, unless you've actually just done something to me terrible, which, I like to forgive for the most part, but I don't run too many of those people. I mean, there's people that don't like me. I get that. That's just part of life. I mean, but I stopped going out of my way to please all the people all the time. We hear that all the time, right? And, if there's somebody that unsubscribed to the show, okay, I get it. Not everybody likes my opinion. Not everybody likes hearing me. If you subscribe to like my master feed, you have, of the 14 shows on that feed, 12 are with my voice. If you can listen to 12 shows with me on them on one, oh my goodness, dude, seriously. I don't know whether to thank you or commit you to an asylum. It's a lot of Jason Bryant in your ears, man.
So let's touch on that a little bit. Why do you think, as you started to grow and add shows to the network, that it just made more sense, or the preference was to have you as the host?
That's kind of my pitch, because I've been covering wrestling for 20 years. I've been covering the college and Olympic scene since about 2003. So I go to the Olympics. I go to the World Championships. I'm working the NCAA championships since 2002 at Division I, Division II, Division III, the NAIA. All the college sports fans know what I'm talking about. So I know these people. I know these coaches. And the pitch is that, hey, let's do a show. It's me. I'm a little bit of a draw for some of these coaches. Be like, yeah, well, Jason Bryant's going to do our show. And that, some of the fan base knows who I am. Some of them don't, because the college fan bases recycle every 5-6 years when the kids graduate and there's a new crop of fans in. So honestly, I've built a reputation, and sometimes it's good. Sometimes I like to think it's good. I'm a lot less vocal on Twitter and social media than I used to be. Even though I am my own boss, it's not like I'm going to get fired, but I could lose a client out of it. And I'm a little bit more careful, little more adult. I'm 36 now. It's not like I'm the 25 brash, arrogant, hey, I'm Internet. Yeah, look at me, I'm the best. You get over yourself pretty quickly there. So, they just, I think you've developed the rapport with people and they trust you. And that's one thing that I can sell them on is, I'm not going to make you look stupid. I'm going to put out a good product, and you're going to like what you get. I guarantee it. Oh, wait, that's Men's Warehouse. Sorry, George Zimmer.
Talk a little bit about the network and what the original intent was, and how it's grown since you started it.
What was the original intent? I don't know. Replace my income, really. And that's a rule. I've broken a lot of rules of podcasting too. It's like, don't get into podcasting to make money. Well, I didn't initially, and then it just kind of opened the door there. So the idea, and I'll give you the non Dave Jackson version, but listening to college XM radio, and I'm hearing all these coaches shows, and I had this show called the Short Time Wrestling Podcast, which initially started as like a 10-minute thing. At the end of each night, I'd go, okay, here are the scores. Let me record 10 minutes and then post it so people in the morning waking up could get their news like in the shower or on the way to work. And then the season ended. I'm like, well, okay, there's no news. Let's interview people. All right. And then they started going, and people were like, well, I like the shorter ones. And I'm like, I really like that interview with David Taylor. And it's like, okay. And then, I'm doing that for, I think it went through several months. I was doing that from the start of that season. I think I went through 13, all of 14. Yeah. So yeah, it was probably November through June is when I had done that. I'm the Short Time show. And then I started listening to this XM radio. I was like, wait a minute, there's all these coaches shows out there for football and basketball. I was like, I can do that for wrestling. So I had a couple guinea pigs that first year, and then that took off. And then I've got this one group wants to do it. This organization wants to do it. This school wants to do it. And it's like, all right, well, what do I call this? And I was actually struggling with the name when I came up with the concept. I'm like, what do I call this? What do I call this? And I was like, do I wrestling podcast style? Or I was looking for everything I could, and everything was like pro wrestling stuff. And then I came back to it. I was like, I wonder if my old domain, mattalkonline.com, got lifted from me years ago. It was a weird situation where my domain and name secure, and there was a transfer that didn't go through, and I lost my domain. And the worst part was that the bot wiped out any reference of me ever owning it. I'd owned it since 2000, and it had said, or I owned it since 2002, and the bot comes back and says, owned by, it was like some Korean reseller, said even archive.org was wiped clean. Like, it was like there was no proof I ever actually had this domain, and it says owned since 1997. I'm like, what the, so, and then I was like, on a whim, I'm like, let me type it in. Because, sometimes you type in an address wrong.
Yeah.
Say this domain may be for sale. It's like, I typed in matttalkonline.com, one of those bland landing pages that kind of looks like what you're looking for. And you scroll down, this domain may be for sale. Click, and it sent me to a GoDaddy page. I'm like, Matt Talk Online is back. I knew right then and there that was because that was the site that I built myself through in wrestling, was my high school wrestling website in Virginia called Matt Talk, which was an extension of a radio show. And I didn't go into a whole lot of detail on this about that, but Matt Talk Online was what I became a name for in Virginia and what people got to know me with nationally. So I went back to my roots. That was, a guy from Win Magazine, a wrestling magazine, goes, you need to brand yourself more. And what was more brandable to me than my own first creation, Matt Talk? That was me. That was what I am. And so when I told people Matt Talk is back, they're like, yes. I'm like, well, it's going to be a little different. And they're like, I don't care. It's back. And it's funny because I now have a landing page for all that old archive stuff now. So you can go back and look at the old results from like 1997, 98. They were laid out on Microsoft Publisher. Yeah.
Interesting.
So where am I going with the network? I got a landing page. It's just wrestling podcasts, man. I mean, we're a niche. Every niche has a niche. There's 77 D1 college teams. There's 100 D3 teams. There's 50 D2 teams. There's 50 NAIA teams. That's 300 something fan bases you can talk to directly.
Yeah.
Getting them to buy it is a little different, but
Well, it's such an important lesson because you've niched so narrowly into this, yet demonstrated how much more you have to go. Like all the colleges and divisions that you mentioned give you so many avenues. And I guarantee you're still having conversations with people who have no idea like what either what a podcast is or what the value of being on a podcast is or why it's important to have your own show or who you can reach with a podcast. And it seems like you'll, for at least the short term, be constantly educating people on why this is important for them and how you can add value.
Yeah, and I was really trying to figure out from a business standpoint, how can I make this work? And I replaced my income from the previous job, which was nice. And thankfully, my wife does pretty well. And that's one of I think the keys Dave says is that successful podcasters usually have something else going for them. Well, thankfully, the woman who occupies the desk behind me in my downstairs office, she was supportive of it. Obviously, she knows my passion on it. So, we were in a situation where I could take the risk. The company I was working with prior, in between USA Wrestling and what I'm doing now, they basically stopped. I was not getting paid. It was like, all right, I liked what I did there. I was doing, good work building their brand, but I wasn't getting paid. I'm in my 30s now. I'm married with a child. I don't do stuff for free, man. I mean, I do, but I don't, not for a living. I can't give away this stuff, this time. So no, but that was really the difference.
It's important that I'm a firm believer of people being compensated for their time. And even like when friends do some like development work for me to help me like tweak some stuff on the website, I always make it a point. I just want to compensate people and demonstrate to people that their time is valuable, their skills are valuable, and they should be paid for what it is that they're experts at. Because at some point down the line, I have some stuff that I'm offering as services, and if I feel like I want to be compensated, then well, I see this as just like a flow. Like you got to give into the system if you want to get back from it, and if you want to be compensated, then compensate people. And that's I do
at least offer.
Yeah,
at least offer. Hey man, what do you want for that? Oh no, don't worry about it. No, I want to. What's your PayPal? I don't worry about it.
Yeah,
because there's been some people in podcasting that I've talked with on chats, not so much Blabs yet because we're not there yet. We're getting there.
Not Blab buddies.
But like, I want to say, there's a guy that up in Canada, Kyron Mountain, who's in our podcasters group therapy session, and he does a lot of audio editing, and he does some good stuff. And he sent me a template and says, "Hey, see if I've been playing around with this. See if you can use this." And it was an audition template, and I'm like, "Oh yeah." So I was like, "What do you want for it?" And it was one of those things. Like, I think I'm going to end up giving this away. I appreciate it, but I was like, I've been tweaking his templates, like Dave talked about the recipe thing when I was, it's like, well, that's it. And I've been tweaking things here and there that I like, and I keep my editing really simple. So, but somebody like that just, you build a rapport with over a couple hours in a Google Hangout, and I'm offering it, it's like, sometimes people are, hey, what do you want for it? And I'll be like, nah, just don't worry about it. At least the offer, I think, really goes a longer way than the actual payment does.
Yeah, at least it's showing some consideration for the effort they put in. When did you start going after celebrities who had some connection with wrestling?
That probably started at the end of last college wrestling season. So it would have been 2014, if I'm getting my dates right. Yeah. So the college season ends in March of 14. I've got no, no events to cover. So I'm like, all right. And I started doing a couple, and I noticed that Sage Karam was an 18-year-old kid. And I was actually I'd written a story on him for the magazine I was working for. And he was a high school kid at Nazareth High School in Pennsylvania in the Lehigh Valley. And he was a high school senior and racing in the Indy 500. And he was wrestling. He was a high school wrestler, and he was racing in the Indy 500 as a high school senior.
Wow.
So I'm like, okay, that's an interesting story, because I'd already written the story and I wanted to get him on the podcast. This is, I guess, 2 weeks after he raced, and we were talking about the experience. He finished 10th that year. I think he got wrecked in the first lap this year, and he was kind of very, very bitter about it, deservedly so. So here was one, and then I'm looking through, and I see something that a woman named Ariel Ross Marino. She's from Virginia and was a high school wrestler. She was Miss Virginia USA, and I'm like, that's a cool wrestling story.
Wow.
And then I'm getting some people that are leaders in wrestling that are, like a guy named Mike Novogratz is a big hedge fund guy on Wall Street. They wrestled at Princeton. He's been involved in wrestling, so he wasn't like a new person. Then I started getting these ideas, and I was like, okay. And I remember it was in January. It was December last year. I was like, all right. I looked up. My wife had never seen Vision Quest, which is like the wrestling movie.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the wrestling movie. It's terrible, but it's the greatest wrestling movie because it's the only wrestling movie until Win-Win. And we're not even going to talk about Foxcatcher. But so she had seen it. And I'm like, I wonder when this came out. And I go to Wikipedia. I was like, or IMDb or whatever it was. I'm like, 85. And this is like, winter last year. And I'm like, 30. I got to do a 30-year anniversary thing. I got to do this. So then, I got the author of the book, who I had previously done an interview with in 2008. And then I tracked down the guy who was Shoot. And I also, getting Matthew Modine, I had been trying to start poking at him on Twitter to see if he would be receptive. And then he finally answered one day. I was like, here, talk to this guy. And I was also trying to do this to make sure that the people in the competing space didn't notice that I was trying to get Matthew Modine. So I had to be like, all right, if I make it abundantly clear that I'm trying to get him on the show, somebody's going to try to get him before me. So, once I got Modine, and then actor Nate Parker, who him I got because I've known him. I covered him in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get one, you get two. And then, getting the Mario Lopez thing took me 5 months. But being able to say I've had Nate Parker, I've had Brooks Wheelan from Saturday Night Live. It's just, and the Brooks Wheelan thing is funny because I knew he wrestled, and his brother was a coach in Iowa, and he had posted, check out wrestling guy Brooks Wheelan on Saturday Night Live. And it's like, all right, cool. And I watched that season. I was like, hey, there's the wrestling. There's Brooks. And then his brother was following me on Twitter. I was like, hey, what's the relation there? He goes, yeah, he's my little brother. I'm like, I'd love to get him on the show. And he's like, yeah. So we didn't go through his agent in that respect. It was like, hey, here's his number. And I started texting him, I get that. So anytime that I've got some wants, and some of them are going to have to wait. Chris Pratt is a want. He wrestled. He was a state place winner in high school. Obviously, Neil deGrasse Tyson, tough guy to get a hold of. He wrestled at Harvard. Tim Ferriss wrestled at Princeton. These are people that have genuine appeal outside of wrestling. And I think that's one thing that I can do with my short time show that will appeal to more people and it will also educate the wrestling community. Because some people, I was reading, I think I was using the Tim Ferriss's slow carb diet or whatever was in his book. And I didn't realize it was Tim Ferriss. And the guy who handed it to me was a wrestler in college, didn't know that Tim Ferriss wrestled. So there's a lot of connections. People like, listen to Tim Ferriss. Like, do you know he wrestled? They're like, what, really? That's the thing there. So you can play that advocacy role. And getting the celebs, it's not necessarily a cool factor because there's more signatures on my wall right now that I'm more impressed with than any actor. I'm sure it would be cool to sit down with Mario Lopez and have a beer and talk about Saved by the Bell. I sat down at my desk and had an interview and talked about Saved by the Bell. I could have been drinking a beer. He could have been drinking a beer. Who knows? But there's the cool factor. I don't get starstruck by it. But I'm more impressed with the people. Like, to me, the celebrities are the Jordan Burroughs. This is a guy you've never heard of, but he's a 4-time world Olympic champion, the greatest wrestler on the planet right now. And the problem is he doesn't dribble a ball. He's not in the NBA, so nobody knows him. This guy is a phenomenal athlete. I love talking to Jordan Burroughs more than I would like talking to Matthew Modine or Mario Lopez, because to me, he's an icon of sport. And if little things like that can get our sport more mainstream, I'm kind of preaching the advocacy role right now. But
well, I think
it's cool.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think one of the things you alluded to on Dave's show was the fact that those people think I'm going to have the celebrity on and it's going to, boost my ratings incredibly. And those aren't the most popular shows, I think you've said.
No, actually, a matter of fact, I'll pull up another screen here while we can do some creative editing as I'll actually share some statisticos with you. And I'm not trying to brag when I say this, because I don't honestly, I don't really ask what other people get for shows. I know what the Libsyn average is, but sometimes my shows are crazy, because I actually moved over fully this show to Libsyn in January. So I'm coming up on 1 year. So when we look at the stats in 1 year, my biggest downloaded show is one I did last October. And I'm actually going to interview these people again tonight, or at the Monday that we record this. And that's for an event that they have on the 1st of November, October 31st, 1st of November. They embedded it on the front page of their website. It was not autoplay. I want to clarify that. Not autoplay. That episode has 33,254 downloads.
Nice.
That just on this side of things. When it was still hosting with the other company, I think it had, that episode's probably got 80,000 downloads. And that's just 2 high school people in North Carolina. A lot of that's, listen, folks, if you're interviewing people, get them to embed your show or vice versa. Because that's one thing. Like Cale Sanderson, head coach at Penn State, has got 5,000 downloads. That was from February. The Vision Quest series part 2 with the guy who played Shoot, not with Modine, has 4,000 plus downloads. Cleveland State cuts their wrestling program last year. I get their athletic director on the horn, and I basically go after him with I basically kind of light him up with facts and stats. That thing, 4,100 downloads, and now they kept their wrestling program. I don't know how much of a role I had in that, but getting that Modine 3,600. So I'm getting, those are pretty good numbers. Mario Lopez is creeping towards 2,000, and that was about a month and a half ago. So I think those are good numbers. I'm looking at I'm probably getting 500 a day across that particular show. When the power programs, the Iowa, the Penn States, the Minnesotas, they're going to get the traffic because their fan base eats up everything. But, when somebody discovers a new story about a guy from Sacred Heart who I just interviewed, and they're like, oh, I didn't know about that, I think my job is done.
Yeah.
I've educated somebody on something they didn't know about before.
And it just speaks to who the audience is and how well you know the audience, and the fact that you can bring this wide range of guests on, that you color sometimes with celebrities, but more importantly, you bring on people that are important in the space, and those actually end up having the bigger downloads. Means that you have a clear idea of, avatar, if you want to use that word, but just who your audience is. And you always have that, I imagine, in the back of your mind, like who are the guests that are going to provide the most value for my audience? And you think about that as you grow the show.
Well, there's that. There's two. And there's also additional validity in terms of, I'm fighting with the WWE right now. Not necessarily fighting, but, people are like, wait a minute, you're the Olympic wrestling. Yeah, but there's a lot of guys that went from college into that side of things. And of course, their names change. But there's a guy, Chaz Betts, who was an Olympian on the Greco-Roman team in 2012 from Minnesota. I've known him since high school. Since he was in high school, I covered him when he was a athlete in the junior nationals and things like that. And now he's Chad Gable in the WWE's NXT, which is based out of Florida. Kind of like their developmental talent type of thing. And I want Chaz on my Minnesota Guillotine show, and I have to go through their PR, and it's just like, I'm not getting emails back. I'm not getting emails. Texts aren't being responded to. So I'm fighting with them a lot. So when I get guests like that, if I can kind of tell the WWE or somebody or some big time agency is like, look, I've had Mario Lopez, I've had Matthew Modine, I've had Sage Karam, I've had Mike Golick, I've had these people on my show. I'm not some flash in the pan, fly by night fanboy. So, not that there's anything wrong with being a fanboy. Let me get that about abundantly, because I'm trying to do this as journalistically and entertainment wise. I'm also not a Jim Rome either. I'm not going to call Jim Everett Chris Everett and have him throw me through a table. So, but it's when you get guests like that, people look at you, I think, a little bit different. Like, wow, how did Bryant get that person on the show? And that to me brings a little bit more professionalism and a little more mainstreaming of it to me a little bit. And I love getting those guests, even though I know that they're not necessarily going to be, I'm kind of disappointed sometimes when I don't get the big numbers on a Matthew Modine. That, when I say big numbers, I'm expecting big numbers. when I say big numbers, I'm expecting maybe I'd like to get Mario Lopez retweeted it. He has almost 1 million followers. Well, not 1 million people didn't see that tweet. 1 million people didn't click that link. I can tell you that because he's only got 2,000 downloads in about a month and a half. But to a lot of people, 2,000 downloads is a really good number. That's a good show. That's a really good.
Yeah, that's a really good. Those are really good numbers. That's definitely something to be proud of.
I'm freaking college wrestling, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
and I think
here's the thing. Sorry, here, but I want to say, like, I'm doing when I'm on your show, I'm on Dave's show. I've done, with Fred Castaneda, I've done a couple things. I know I'm not going on your show to get more listeners to my show because this is not a crossover type of audience. There's always going to be entrepreneurs in the podcast space who are going to listen to other entrepreneur shows and say, hey, yeah, come over to my show. By chance, I think Bill Conrad's the only guy I've met that has any type of wrestling experience because his son wrestled at the Coast Guard Academy. That's like the one guy that found my show through these things. So I'm not doing all these interviews to get more people to listen to wrestling. If you have an interest in wrestling, by sure all means, I know a show that you might be interested in. Or if you've got a brother or a sister or a mom, aunt, uncle, that's kind of maybe, hopefully they'll get it. But I'm not doing this stuff for word of mouth. I just like hearing myself talk. Oh, wait.
The truth comes out. No, I think you'd be surprised at the connections that somehow happen because someone happened to hear you on the show and they have some friend or relative that was into wrestling, or maybe someone that'll be a good guest on a show, or maybe even someone that knows some of these through a connection, these celebrities that you're trying to get on. So
yeah, if you know Tim Ferriss, I've actually got a good line of dialogue with like his PR person. And Tim's a guy that doesn't do anything unless it's a quote, hell yes. So he's going to be tough to get. I know he's busy. Chris Pratt's filming through like the end of the Mayan calendar or whatever. And, Neil deGrasse Tyson, if anybody's got a contact for Neil, I really want to get him on the show because trying to go through the conservatory and whatever the astrophysicist place is, it's kind of tough. So if anybody's got a tip, or if you know somebody that wrestled that would be, remember high school, college, Olympic level wrestling, not he's got a chair, oh my God type of wrestling, which I still kind of watch. But send me a note, man. I'm looking I'm looking for stories. That's another thing too. I like for other people to tell stories.
Hey, no harm in putting it out there. So you've obviously got a gift for interviewing, for broadcasting, for being on the radio, for being a personality. What would you say is your differentiating skill when it comes to interviewing guests?
With a lot of the guys now, this is very different from a journalistic standpoint because I'm in a sport where a lot of these people become your friends, and it's a very small media community. I often joke that I've met most everybody in wrestling at the Bison Turf, which is a bar in Fargo, North Dakota, because there's a big giant tournament out there for 8 days every July. And I've been going for 17 years. So it's a fairly true statement, but I've met people and you get, you just talk wrestling, you recognize them, they recognize you, and you generate a conversation and you remember people, you build up a rapport. So with a kid like a kid now, he's like 26 now, but a guy like David Taylor, who I just did an interview with last month, that's gotten good numbers. On a Throwback Thursday, I posted on Twitter the screenshot of the video I did an interview with him his freshman year in high school. He was about maybe 100 pounds, and he was wrestling at this monster tournament in Delaware. And that was 10 years ago. I've known that guy 10 years. I've interviewed him multiple times throughout his career. And when you get to know these people, when you see them in high school and they see you, and then they get in college and they're more comfortable, and then they're on the senior level or they're into coaching. I'm 36 now. Most of the coaches, when I started in the sport, were in their 40s and 50s, and a lot of them have retired and moved on. Now it's my contemporaries they're people that I went to college with at the same time that have families, and we're adults now together. And we came up, we were hard charging in our 20s, and now we're grown up. So I think knowing people beyond what's in the box score or what's in a press release really, really helps, because you can always throw an inside joke to kind of lighten the mood of something that, my rule's off the record. If I'm having a beer, I'm off the record. There's, that's a fine line, because everybody can get in some fun when there's a beer or two to be had. So I've been around some things like, hey, Bryant, you're not going to write about this, are you? I'm like, dude, come on. I'm right there. What, am I going to sell myself out? So honestly, that's part of the trust, and just, building that rapport. You sit down, you talk wrestling, and you meet people for who they are. And I think that's what really makes mine different is I don't come off fake. I'm not going to sit there and be like, well, tell me about that match. I'm going to say, well, in this match, so what was, I'll be generally interested about that match versus just tell me about that match. Or, I'm not going to read a press release and ask questions off a press release. I'm going to use probably maybe as a guide for certain things, but I'm going to dig deeper. With Mario Lopez, I listened to like 3 different interviews that he did, and I was like, okay, what am I? And this is rare that I do this, but with somebody like that, I didn't want to ask the same question that he'd been asked 100 times. So yes, I asked the Saved by the Bell questions. I didn't ask any Dancing with the Stars questions. I didn't ask very much extra questions or Pacific Blue. I'm sure he's trying to forget that, but I wanted to ask questions that I was interested in, and I know my fan base would be interested in, that weren't the same questions over and over. So there's research, and then that personability factor. I can probably call up most of these kids. It's weird because I'm following people on Twitter, and it's like, okay, I'm not trying to be like stalking or anything, but I'm a journalist, and they're athletes, and they've got Twitter accounts. They expect to get followed. So I'll send somebody a DM, hey man, you want to be on the show? They're like, yeah. Remember that time I interviewed you back in the day? You've got that relationship that really, really helps. Really helps.
And it comes across, and the listener can hear it. They can hear the genuine conversation. The fact that, yeah, these people, while they may not be buddy, there's a certain intimacy with this conversation, and it comes across as genuine. And it's just nothing more awkward than hearing a conversation where it sounds like, excuse me, these people don't know each other.
Well, I actually had one of those the other day that was kind of tough. I mean, sometimes you get kids that a lot of the people I'm talking to have done interviews before, so it's a little easier for them to be comfortable with that, with a question on the other side of a Skype or something like that. But there's a kid on the Division III show that I do, and he'd obviously never been interviewed, and his record's not very good, so there wasn't really a whole lot for him to ever have been interviewed about. And it was a little tough, and I tried to draw it out of him a little bit. And it was maybe a 5-minute segment. I was interviewing 3 wrestlers back to back to back, and the next time I talk to that kid, he's gonna be a little more comfortable. And it was kind of tough to push through it, but he's learned something from it. I've learned something from it. Next time I have to ask this kid questions, I know how to shape the question differently. So, and the coach, gave me some heads up, like this kid might be a little tough to talk to, and that's fine. And we made it work. So sometimes you can't avoid a stiff interview. It's just impossible. You're never going to have 100% of your interviews go perfect either.
Well, I may be a bit partial here, but I think this interview is 100% perfect right now between you and I.
Even after that, like flub that I had or whatever, or the
No, I think what's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because we've obviously seen each other online and engaged online. I think it was that Blab session that sort of sealed it for me, where we had International Podcast Day, and we can tell just like who the hardcore geeks about podcasting, anything related to podcasting, give me more podcasting. And we were just watching all our peers in the space and just engaging and making, comments on. And I think it was late for you because my session didn't come on until 9 p.m. West Coast.
I was on that Blab 16 hours that day. And it wasn't just because I was sponsoring it either.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a bronze level sponsor, but again, that's kind of what I was saying. I didn't do that for people to just hey, I enjoy what you guys do. Here's some, if I can do that, I can do that. But yeah, that podcast day thing was awesome.
Yeah. So I think
I interrupted your story.
No, I think it speaks to.
Tell me more about me again. No,
people who are passionate, who have a sense of humor, who don't take themselves too seriously, and who I can have on the show, and we can just relate, and we can talk podcasting, we can talk wrestling, we can talk celebrities, we can talk Blab, but I think more importantly, we can talk about why we enjoy this medium so much, why we're passionate about it, and why we don't see ourselves not doing this, and being involved in this space for a long time to come.
Yeah, and I like this medium because it gives, we talked about the niches. It gives those 4 college teams that I have a voice. It gives the Wrestling Hall of Fame a voice. It gives a couple of these coaching outlets a voice. I mean, and I have my own voice. I mean, Short Time is my flagship show of the 12 that I do. Distribute 14 of that. So, again, if you're listening to 12 of my shows, oh, bless you. But, you give that voice. And I'm not walking around anymore going, yeah, I'm the best. I do a little bit of marketing, like consistently the top rated wrestling podcast on iTunes. I mean, because I have to say consistently, because one day somebody's going to pop up ahead of you and like, oh, we're number 1 now, or we're ahead of you now, and tomorrow you'll drop off. But so I'm saying consistently, you got to pump yourself up a little bit with marketing and all that. But I've found the fact, yeah, I got a show. And yeah, I got Short Time Wrestling Podcast. I'm on Matt Talk Online. You'd be like, yeah, I've got hey, yeah, you need to come on the #1 wrestling podcast. No, it's just, I like what I'm doing because I'm comfortable with the format. Everybody that you meet, and the thing is, it's about that community thing. Everybody that I've met in podcasting, for the most part, I mean, everybody's got their outliers. Every community's got their outliers. Their drunken uncle, But I enjoy talking podcasting. It's like I'm on Blab, like, and there's ever. Hani Moore has been on how many blabs about his new Simple Live Press, and I'm in like every one going, I don't know how I'm going to use this thing yet, but I just like hearing what Hani's got to say about things like this. And it's like, I just, when Daniel's on something, I'll consume it. When Ray or Dave do something, I'm on it. When I see like the rare times Podcast Junkies shows up, like I got a notification from Blab, like Podcast Junkies just joined. I was like, oh, let's see what they're doing. It's kind of stalkerish, creepy, but maybe not for you specifically.
That's cool.
But yeah, because even though your hair is it's dreamy, you're really not my type. But but just this whole community, it's gives me an outlet, and you know what? It's nice to be compensated for your passion too.
Yeah, I'm just always surprised by the quality of the folks that are in the space, how they're all giving and accommodating, friendly. We all want to help each other. And I don't see that changing in the short time anytime soon. And I'm just really happy to be a part of it. And I'm really happy I got a chance to finally get you on the show.
Yeah, and I actually want to throw a couple of your old guests a bone here because I was thinking about it. I was like, which episodes of Podcast Junkies have I really enjoyed? I'm sitting there going through them, and a couple of these people I hadn't met, or I've met briefly, but like obviously Daniel J. Lewis was the first one that I discovered your show on back in June of 14. And it's like, then, Nick Subling was on recently. You've got to know Nick, not like super well, but we've been buddies since like April. And, I'm on my Short Time is on his SPNT network. So my flagship show is on his network. Reached out to him earlier, obviously Jen show. And then who doesn't like the real Bryant? I mean, come on, that guy's just, let's rock it. I just want to I don't have a catchphrase. I mean, he's got that. I mean, the closest thing I've got is like the close on the Clamor cast where I just go, clamor on, Dave. That's the only thing. It's not even my show when I get that.
You could do something related to wrestling, like what's the countdown before you get pinned or something like that? I don't know.
Well, in college, there's not a 1, 2, 3.
Oh, there's not. Okay.
That's the pro stuff. Okay. But like Kim Trumbo's show, I briefly, or that episode with her, I might have said hello to her at NMX. But I remember other people were talking to her because she had been around, and I was like, okay, I remember seeing her at NMX, and then she popped up on the show, and I enjoyed that one. Vernon Ross I met on the Metro at Podcast Midwest on the way in. I mean, obviously anything with Ray, and when Rob Walsh talks stats, it's like geek out time. So those are who have I not mentioned? No, those are pretty much that's the shows I've really enjoyed, mainly again because what we were talking about earlier. It's like those are the people I've met and had an opportunity to, and there's other shows that I've listened to that I've enjoyed. I just haven't met those people yet. So when I meet a Chris Cerrone, I'll be like, oh, okay. I met Lou Mangello, didn't have a chance. I mean, that's one of those ones that it's flagged to listen to, but with 100 shows, I've got to
it's hard
to figure it out. And Podcast Junkies is 1x speed. It's not. I'm not going 2x on Podcast Junkies.
Well, I'm honored to hear that. Well, Jason, thanks for the various rabbit holes we went down today. I really appreciate it.
I think they're more like gopher tunnels because they're intertwined. Your head pops up over here. Your head pops over here. We're talking about beer over here, and then wrestling, and then I didn't even mention roller derby, which is rare, but I just did. All right.
Okay, we got that in. So that's just one more keyword I'll be able to add to this episode: roller derby.
And Dave Lee will be all over that.
So, where's the best place for folks to track you down?
The local neighborhood. Best place to track me down is at matttalkonline.com. That is the landing page for my entire network. My flagship show is the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. Twitter, I'm actually fairly prolific on Twitter. Jason M. Bryant, because Jason Bryant was taken. And I actually follow that one. But Jason M. Bryant on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. You can just find me, Jason Bryant there. And anything, you'll see the Matt Talk logos and stuff. Matt Talk Online is on Facebook and Twitter. But I got a feeling a lot of the Podcast Junkie listeners aren't really as interested in the wrestling part of it. So I'll just hand more of it at Jason M. Bryant on Twitter.
So I think one of the things that you can take away from this interview is just how methodical Jason is about his network and his approach to podcasting, and just the very fact that he's a host on several of the shows on his network makes me realize that he understands what an asset he is, his voice is, his expertise, his professionalism, his years of experience, all that is the suite of things that he brings when he approaches schools, when he realizes that there's an untapped market out there. And he goes after him because he knows very well that he can put on a quality show and have them realize that it's an asset to have a podcast as part of their program. So kudos to him. I wish him nothing but the best. Please check out Matt Talk Online. I'm very happy I got a chance to spend some time with him here on this interview. He's always so fun when we run into each other on these online groups, on a Blab or on a Google Hangout. And he just always makes me laugh with his comments. And I just knew from the moment we engaged online that he was someone I wanted to have a conversation with. And I'm looking forward to actually continuing that in person. So we have Podcast Movement coming up in July in Chicago. So it's never too early to get tickets for that. So make sure you do that as well. Don't forget that we are now a member of the Podcastica Network. And as a reminder, the shows on there are The Walking Dead Cast, Evil Dead Cast, Under the Comic Covers, the Sci-Fi Movie Podcast, Once Upon a Podcast, and Game of Microphones, which I think personally is an amazing name for a podcast about Game of Thrones. So a recent episode of Once Upon a Podcast, episode 82, talks about Broken Kingdom. And so the ladies talk about their thoughts, and they want to know what you think about King Arthur. Is he the ultimate villain in the season or not? And what about the whole Guinevere-Lancelot love triangle? Those are important questions that Brittany and Amanda are asking, and they debate those points on the show. And if you're a fan of Once Upon a Podcast, then I highly recommend you check that out. Thanks again to our musical production guru, Cedar and Soil. You can find his music at cedarsoil.com. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Don't forget, you can always find our super detailed show notes, and we put a lot of work into them. We give you a summary of the show, timestamps, so you can jump around to points made during the conversation. And the reason I bring that up is actually the new Overcast app, Marco Arment's app, is now free. They used to charge for it, but you can get it for free. And one of the really cool things that I noticed is that because we have timestamps in our show notes, I see those as markers in Overcast. So that's really cool. And it allows you to click through specific points if you want to jump around in the episode. So check that out if you haven't done so already. He's got a sponsorship or a donation button inside the actual app. So if you do like it, then definitely support that. I think it's a fantastic app, and it's my podcatcher of choice. Don't forget that the retention hashtag for this episode, since it's about wrestling, we'll call it hashtag Jason321. So JASON 321, hashtag Jason321, and let me know that you've made it this far. Because you're cool, because you're awesome, I'm going to give you a virtual high five through this microphone. And don't forget, tell your friends about the show. Join the conversation. We've had some really fun back and forths on Twitter, on Instagram, and our Facebook page. And if you haven't done so already, I sound like a broken record, but thanks for supporting us through the subscription, which is actually the most important thing for an iTunes podcast, is first the subscription. So if you go there and all you do is subscribe, then that's awesome. And then after that, if you feel so compelled to write a review and a rating of 5 stars or less, depending on how you're feeling that day, then I'd be much obliged. Thanks again for everything you do. The listenership is growing. The fans are growing. The comments are growing. And I appreciate all of you who have been there since the beginning. And I appreciate the new fans that are coming on board and the new listeners. So thanks again. Have a fantastic weekend, guys. And tune in next week when I talk to Christina Canters of the C Method. That's another engaging, fun conversation. We laughed a lot during that as well. So stay tuned for that, episode 62. Take care.